The American Chess Cup 2025 finals in the women's section featured 15-year-old but already one of the top three American chess players Alice Lee and Tatev Abrahamyan, who is currently ranked 7th in the country. Tatev won the first game with the black pieces and now just needs a draw with the white pieces to become a champion, and she played this game with 93% accuracy. Will it be enough? Let's take a look. Tatev starts with e4, we have c6, and that's already the first surprise of the game. Because normally, Caro-Kann defense, you don't play it when you must win, and this is exactly what Alice has to do in this game. She has to win in order to continue with the match. d4, d5, knight d2, exchange of the pawns on e4. Bishop jumps to f5, immediately challenged by the knight from g3. Retreats to g6, h4, threatening the move h5 to trap the bishop and win it. h6 creating an escape square for the bishop, knight develops to f3, knight d7, h5 hitting the bishop goes back to h7, and bishop d3 offering the exchange of light square bishop, offer accepted, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and e6. In this type of structures, white puts their pawns on white squares, so the dark square bishop is becoming a very, as we say, good piece for black. Bishop d2, knight f6, long castle, bishop e7. Black position is very solid, but very passive. Not sure how Alice is planning to win. All her pieces are still on the last three ranks. King b1, castle, knight e4, c5, first active move by Alice, but now it leads to a series of exchanges, starting with pawn takes c5, knight takes c5, exchange of the knights on f6, exchange of the queens, and bishop e3. And we have an endgame that has 6 pawns against 6 pawns, knight and bishop against knight and bishop, 2 rooks against 2 rooks. Absolutely even position, very difficult to imagine how black are going to play for a win here. And here is the first hint of that. Knight a4. And now white have some problems. They need to defend the pawn on b2, and the move c3 does not work because of first rook takes d1 with the check, rook takes d1, and bishop takes c3. And let's say b takes c3, knight takes c3, and forking the rook and the king, so black would have a substantial advantage in this position. So c3 doesn't work, but there is another good move, bishop d4. Bishop d4, rook takes d4, rook takes d4, knight takes d4. More exchanges on the square d4, and now we have even a simpler version of the endgame, 6 pawns against 6 pawns, rook and knight against rook and knight. Absolutely even position. Alice plays rook d8. Knight is under attack, so the pawn from c3 is supporting that knight. e5, attacking the knight. Knight goes back to f3. Now, if black continues to pursue the knight, then after the move e4, simply knight will go back to d4, and again this position is totally equal. Black plays f6, Tatev goes king c2, knight c5, rook e1, rook d5, still absolutely even endgame. The black king starts going to the middle of the board, b4 attacking the knight, and knight jumps to d3. Rook e2, protecting the pawn on f2, f5. Now black have some active connected pawns on e5 and f5, but nothing dangerous for white. Here comes the first move from Tatev that I really was puzzled about. The move knight g1. It's much more natural to hop to the square h4 and attack the pawn on f5, or even go to a square d2. Then with possibility of going to like c4 and attacking the pawn on e5. There were many different variations that Tatev could choose here, but she chose a very passive move, knight g1. The idea of this move is to play f3 and not to allow black to play e4 with the pawn to make progress with those pawns. Black plays king f6, f3, that was the plan, b5, totally blocking the queen side of the board for white. Now the squares a4 and c4 under the control of black pawn. Knight h3, still e4, f takes e4, f takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes h5. And here's another moment of the game when Tatev chose a very passive continuation. Very natural move, knight f4, would fork the knight and the rook, and would lead to more exchanges and a pretty easy draw for white. Instead, white plays again knight to g1, knight e5. Very active knight on e5, very passive knight on g1, weak point on g3, and that's what makes black position here better. But better does not mean winning, just better at this point. Knight e2, rook h2, pinning the knight. King goes to b3, the knight is protected by the rook. Knight goes to c4, and that already creates some issues for white because the white knight cannot jump to nice squares d4 or f4 because it's gonna be simply a checkmate rook b2. So white have to be careful here not to make this mistake and blunder a checkmate. King c2, king centralizes to d3, rook h1, and here Tatev made the crucial mistake of the game. What's important to notice here is that white has 2 minutes remaining on the clock, and black, Alice, has 18 minutes and 38 seconds. Too much pressure on the clock for Tatev, and she made the mistake of the game with the move king d4. And you can see in this video that after she made this move, she immediately understood that this was a big mistake, and Alice right away played knight d6. She almost predicted the move king d4 and expected that to happen. And now it turns out that the white rook doesn't have any moves. It's stuck in the middle of the board, which not usually happens to rooks, but this is what happened in this game. Very few squares remaining. If the rook goes to g4, then h5 wins the game, because again the rook has no moves. It's trapped and it's going to be captured. And if the rook goes to e5, then we have rook d1 check. King has to move away to square e3, and black king captures the rook on e5. Therefore, the only other move remaining in this position is the move that Tatev made. She retreats with the rook to square e3, and after knight f5 check, she lost that rook. It's a fork. King moves to e4. Alice captures the rook on e3. King takes e3 and a rook a2. And the problem for white is not only that the rook is much stronger than the knight, but also that the pawn on a2 cannot be protected. So with the next move, Alice will take the pawn on a2, and with the rook against the knight and 4 pawns against 3, it's a very easy conversion for black. And in this position, Tatev resigned, and Alice won the game with the black pieces on demand. She equalized the match 1-1, and we'll have blitz games to determine the winner of American Chess Cup 2025. First blitz game, Tatev is playing white, starts with the move e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and we have Petrov defense, or some call it Russian defense. Knight takes e5, d6 attacking the knight, knight retreats to f3, and black takes the pawn on e4. Now white have a lot of different continuations here. Most popular moves are d4 and knight c3. and Tatev plays knight c3, exchanges the knights on c3, d takes c3. Now white have double pawns, but very active bishops. Bishop e7, bishop e3, castle, queen d2, knight d7, long castle for white, knight jumps to f6, and bishop d3. What's interesting here for me personally is that I play exactly the same variation for white when I am facing Petrov defense, when I'm playing white against black. So this is very familiar to me. And after rook e8, I usually play h3, not to allow the bishop to get to a square g4 and pin my knight on f3. But Tatev plays rook e1 and allows the move bishop g4, creating this unpleasant pin to the knight. But she has other plans. She plays c4. It's an interesting move, and she wants to transfer the black square bishop to a square c3 to get on this nice long diagonal. Queen c8, bishop d4, according to the plan, bishop f5. That's a mistake by Alice. What she missed was that white gets a winning position with the move bishop f takes f6. And it turns out that you cannot take the bishop with the bishop because you're going to lose a bishop on f5 after those couple of moves. So white takes the knight on f6, and black have to take it with the pawn. And now they have ugly pawns, disconnected pawns on the king side of the board, plus the king on g8 is very, very unsafe. And on the g file, white can create a devastating attack, and all Tatev had to do is take the bishop on f5, which seems like a very logical move, because that bishop, light square bishop, is pretty much the only defender of the black king, and it has to be eliminated. So one of the continuations could be bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, knight d4 attacking the queen, queen, let's say, moves back to d7, and simply rook e3, getting to the g file. Then the queen will get to f4, the knight will get to f5, and white's position is simply winning, and easily winning. Unfortunately for Tatev, I guess she didn't understand quite that this bishop on f5 has to be eliminated from the board for white to have a big advantage. And she played queen f4 and immediately allowed Alice to play bishop g6. And now that bishop on g6 is a very good protector of the king, blocking the g file, and not much white can do about it. Knight h4 doesn't really help because the bishop on g6 is protected by two pawns. Queen d7, bishop f5 hitting the queen, and queen a4, very active move, attacking the pawn on a2. And in this position, the best continuation for white was actually the move queen g4. Let's take a look at one variation, queen g4, and now if queen takes a2, which seems kind of dangerous for white, in fact it's not really dangerous, because what happens is bishop g6 takes g6, h takes g6, sacrificing the knight on g6, and after the check from the queen, king f8, rook simply gets into the action through d5, h5, and h8 checkmate, and nothing, and black can have nothing to prevent this. Because let's say after rook takes d5, queen a1 check is not dangerous because king is safe on a square d2. The queen is under attack, the queen goes back, simply rook h5, no defense from a checkmate. So again, Tatev missed an opportunity for a big advantage. Instead, she played a passive move, king b1 and d5. Alice presents another opportunity for white to get a very big advantage with the same idea to move the queen to g4, with the same ideas of sacrificing a piece on g6. Now here white also have to be careful not to take the pawn on d5 with the pawn, because they will lose a queen. Tatev again played a passive move here, b3. And that move is just a bad move. And it's a bad move because the squares, the dark squares near the white king, are so weak that eventually the black square bishop is gonna become an absolute monster. And as we can see, white do not have a black square bishop themselves to counter that bishop, and the game will be decided on those squares. That's looking ahead. Queen a5, knight takes g6, but now it's too late already. H takes g6, bishop d7, attacking the rook. But here's intermediate, nice intermediate move, bishop d6, attacking the queen first. Rook takes e8, rook takes e8, and cannot take the rook right now because, again, the queen is under attack. And take a look at the clock. 25 seconds for Tatev, minute and 8 seconds for Alice. And the clock played a big role here again. This position is already better for black, but white obviously didn't have to lose it right away, but they did with the next move. Queen takes f6. And that's just a losing move. And Alice immediately jumped into the opportunity of playing rook e1. Now you cannot take the rook on e1 because after queen take e1 check, king b2, bishop e5, winning the queen. Let's go back. So therefore, the only move is to protect this rook from capturing is queen f3. But here, black have easy combination. They just play the move bishop e5. And again, the squares, the dark squares, are absolutely not protected around the white king. After bishop e5, Tatev played c3. After exchange of the rooks, queen takes c3, and the battery of the bishop and the queen creates a checkmate threat on a square b2. White plays queen e2 to protect the square on b2, but that doesn't really help. It helps against the checkmate, but doesn't help against black just capturing all white pawns on the queen side. Check, king c2, taking the pawn on a2 with a check, taking the pawn on b3 with a check. In this position, white resigned, as black have too many extra pawns, and Alice will eventually convert one of them into the queen. This is an easily winning position for black, especially considering that white, Tatev only had 3 seconds to go in the game, and her opponent had 51. So after this nice win, Alice leads the blitz match, the match 2-1, and we have one more blitz game to go. And in this game, Alice is playing white, Tatev is playing black, and Alice starts with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and g3. And this is Catalan opening. Catalan opening, very solid opening for white, and I don't play it myself, but I strongly recommend it to players of almost any level, because this leads to a very solid positional game for white, and it's actually not so easy to lose with white playing Catalan defense, especially if black plays passively, and that's exactly what Tatev did by bishop e7, bishop g2, castle, castle, and c6. So she creates this triangle of white pawns, which is again very solid for black, but very defensive. And Tatev had to win this game in order to continue with the match. So I'm not sure if that was the right choice to play this very good but defensive structure. Instead, I would say that she had to capture the pawn on c4, create some imbalances in the position, and try to get the game to be more active. On a personal note, by the way, I play exactly the same way against Catalan opening. But again, she needed to win this one, and therefore just equalizing for black was not enough. Queen c2, b6, b3, bishop develops to b7, bishop b2, knight d7, knight d2, c5. That's a nice aggressive move, challenging white center, creating this box of pawns. Alice plays a3. She doesn't make any exchanges of the pawns. Rook c8, queen b1, moving the queen away from potentially being attacked by the rook. Exchange of the pawns on c4. Bishop jumps to a square e4 and queen a2. Not exactly a good position of the best piece, the queen. It's trapped in the corner of the board, surrounded by its own pieces. So I didn't like this maneuver by Alice. The computer didn't like it either. It shows that black has a slight advantage here. Queen c7, rook c1, and queen b7. Makes total sense to create this battery on the long diagonal of the queen and the bishop. Exchange of the pawns on c5, b4, challenging the knight. The knight goes to a4, potentially looking at capturing a bishop on b2. And that's why Alice decided to exchange that bishop herself. And it turns out that black cannot take the bishop with the bishop on e7 because they will get forked by the knight from d6. Therefore, black has to take the bishop with the pawn, and the king becomes open. But really, it's not a big problem because white don't have many pieces to challenge that king and attack it. Queen b3, b5, knight goes back to d2, attacking the bishop on d5, bishop retreats to d5, challenging the queen, and queen goes to e3, possibly in the future to get to a square, active square h6, to give some problems to the black king. Knight h4. Now, knight on h4 really doesn't have any squares to jump to. g6 and f5 are occupied by black pawns, and that move was made simply for one reason only, and that to exchange that monster bishop on d5. The exchange happens on the square g2, and black exchanges all of the rooks, rook c8, and knight f3, another exchange of the rooks, and basically Alice achieved exactly what she wanted to achieve. She needs a draw in this game. The game now got to an endgame, pretty much even endgame, and very little chances for black to make progress here. Queen d7, knight jumps to an active square f4, and after bishop f8, which was an inaccurate move, white actually already has an advantage after great move knight h5. And now it turns out that the pawn on f6 is really very difficult to defend. Very difficult to defend. The right continuation for black was to play the move queen d8 and protect the pawn on f6. Instead, with only 10 seconds remaining on the clock, and Alice, by the way, have minute 28, Tatev made a crucial mistake of this particular game. She played bishop g7. And it turns out that after queen f4, black do not have a good defense from a simple plan of playing queen g4 and taking the pinned bishop on g7 with the checkmate. There is really no good defense for that. Let's say the game could continue, for example, with the move queen e7, queen g4, queen f8 to protect the bishop, but then knight would simply take on f6 using the pin, and white has an absolutely winning position. Tatev realized that in this particular moment, that her position is totally lost. She had 10 seconds to go and didn't manage to make the next move. She was thinking, put the queen on d1 with the check. It didn't change anything in terms of the game itself because the white position is still winning, but she didn't manage to make this move on time. As you can see, her clock shows all zeros, which means that she technically lost this game on time. Alice won another blitz game, won the match 3-1, and congratulations to Alice Lee to becoming a champion of American Chess Cup 2025. Again, she is only 15 years old, already ranked second in the United States, and has an absolutely bright future, might become a world champion. We'll see. Again, congratulations, Alice Lee. In the men's section, it came to no surprise that the finals featured two top USA chess players, Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana. Two-game match, Nakamura won the first game with the white pieces and now just needs a draw in the second game to become a champion. This game reminded me a little of World Cup finals in soccer. It often happens we might have a great, exciting tournament, and then in the final game, both teams are so afraid to make a mistake and play so safe that the game becomes pretty boring. And it kind of happened this time in the chess game. Looking ahead, I have to tell you that this game was played at almost 99% accuracy by both players, which is simply amazing. Caruana plays white. He starts with d4, d5, c4, c5. And immediately, unusual variation creates a box of pawns. And Nakamura said after the game that he doesn't know the name of this opening himself, but using the help of the engines, I found out that this is called Austrian variation of the Queen's Gambit. Exchange of the pawn on d5, knight f6, knight c3, knight takes d5, knight f3. Exchange of the pawns on d4, knight takes c3, queen takes c3. And we have already a lot of exchanges, and that's only move 7. And that works to Hikaru's advantage because he only needs a draw in this game, and Caruana has to win. Knight c6, e4, a6, not allowing the light square bishop to jump to square b5, bishop e3, bishop g4, all developing moves, rook d1 hitting the queen moves to a5, and Nakamura achieves another goal to exchange the queens and get to an endgame where it would be very difficult to white to make any progress and play for the win. Exchange of the queens, bishop e2, e6, knight e5. Another exchange was offered of the bishops, but first bishop b4, important intermediate move, the check, bishop d2, and now Nakamura has a chance to exchange a pair of bishops, and he does exactly that. And we have an endgame with pretty much symmetrical structure of the pawn, 6 on 6. We have two rooks against two rooks and two knights on the board. Absolutely equal endgame, exactly what Nakamura needs. f6, challenging the knight, and b4, counter challenge of the knight of a5, exchange of the knights, and we have two rook endgame. Rook c8, important move. The rooks belong on open files, and Nakamura immediately gets to an open file. Rook b1, hitting the pawn on b7, rook c7 protecting that pawn, king f3, check, king g3, rook f7. Nakamura plays very pragmatic. He puts both rooks on the 7th rank to protect all his pawns. The only potential problem in his position that those pawns on e6 and e5 are doubled, but it's almost impossible to white to capture them, to get to those pawns. The weakest pawn is e5, but how do you get to this pawn? Impossible. The penetration squares d5 and b5 are taken care with the pawns on a6 and e6, and that was actually the plan for Nakamura, to create this type of position, doubling the rooks on the B file, rook e7, king goes traveling to g4, but really have nowhere to go, all protected by the pawns, h4, king f6, king h5, h6. And Nakamura said that that was an important actually move, not to allow white to, let's say after rook d7, for example, white could play g4 and threaten to play g5, and that would create some issues for black. Nakamura didn't allow that to happen with the move h6, rook b3, g6 check, and now the king has to retreat to g4, and after h5 it has to retreat to g3. Endgame is absolutely equal. Rook c5 challenging the pawn on a5, which is a weak pawn for white in this position. Exchange of the rooks on b7, rook takes a5. Now the pawn on a2 is hanging. Rook b2 to protect that pawn. Obviously, pretty much impossible to white to make any progress here to penetrate into black's position. Black can just stand here still, not to blunder anything, and the game would end in a draw, and that's pretty much what happened. After those moves, the position was repeated 3 times. That's a draw, and Nakamura, after winning the first game and drawing the second, became the American Chess Cup 2025 champion. Congratulations to him, great job. And if you like the video, if you want to see more content, I would really appreciate if you subscribe. Thank you for watching.